start today with a question, and I want you to sit with it for a second before I move on. When was the last time that you said something online, a real opinion, like your actual take on a situation, and then you censored it or dulled it down before you actually hit post, whether that be on Instagram, whether it's on LinkedIn or any other platform? You might have typed it out. You may have even had your finger hovering on that button, and then something stopped you. Some little calculation in the back of your head going, is this worth it? Will this make things harder for me? Am I ready for what perhaps might come next? And if you're a woman, I'd bet good money on the fact that your answer is yes. And I'd also bet that you didn't call it at the time what it actually represents. It's called the silencing effect. And today, that's what we're talking about. This is the First Movers podcast. I'm Yaz London, and this episode is one that I've been building up to for quite some time because it's really personal, it's political, it's professional, and it's really far more urgent than most people care to admit. Today, we're talking about what it actually costs women to be visible online, not in a vague, heavy-handed kind of way, but with numbers, with names, and with receipts. Here's a concept I've been working on a lot in my upcoming book, First Movers, Courageous Leadership for a Human Future in the AI Era, and I call it the good girl bargain. The world, in many ways, to me, still rewards the good girls. Every single day, there are quiet and perhaps not so quiet invitations to shrink, to soften your opinion, to make yourself easier to digest if you're a bit too much, to trade your authenticity for societal approval. And most of us have done it. I've done it, certainly at different times. And I think because historically the women who didn't play by those rules, they always paid the price, didn't they, in one way, shape or form. Now, if we look throughout history, women who stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable femininity were punished through law, through religion, through exclusion or ridicule or shame. And the methods have just changed across generations, but the message has really remained remarkably consistent. Stay in line, toe the line, or pay the price. Now, here's the thing. The bargain, it's still being enforced. Those rules have not gone away. The consequences have not softened, really. What's changed is the location or the venue, if you will. The garden of the good girl has moved very clearly into the online space. And online, the enforcement of this good girl bargain is far more fast. I guess it's louder, it's more coordinated, and thanks to artificial intelligence, it's now more scalable than anything that ever came before it. So let's talk about some of the numbers, because I think sometimes the reality gets lost in the noise of debate here. UN Women's research tells us that between 16 and 58% of women and girls globally report experiencing some kind of digital violence. Now, that is an absolutely massive range, which tells you that the problem's quite hard to measure in many ways, isn't it? But also that no matter how you count it, it's pretty enormous. Drilling down into that further, around 38% of women have personally experienced online abuse. So that includes things like doxing, stalking, harassment, impersonation, defamation, non-consensual intimate imagery, hate speech, AI-generated sexualized content, all of it designed not just to harm people, but to silence them. Now, let's sit with that for a moment, because there's another statistic that I want to share with you, and that is that 4 in 10 women across Australia have experienced this. So it's not a fringe issue. That's the majority of women in your team, in your friendship groups, or in your family as well. The United Nations estimates that 95% of aggressive behavior, harassment, and abusive language in online spaces targets women. 95. And despite this, fewer than 40% of countries have laws that protect women from cyber harassment, which means that right now there's 1.8 billion women and girls around the world that don't have legal protection from this kind of behavior and these sorts of crimes. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this is mostly happening to perhaps celebrities, right? High profile people, the famous ones with big accounts. And in many ways, is that par for the course? Is that something that you accept? And this is a misconception. It's not right. It isn't just high profile women. It is so many women, normal women like you and I. And that's the shift I think that many of us haven't fully reckoned with yet. The deepfake incident for Taylor Swift, for example, in 2024 was one of the first cases that really forced mainstream media, mainstream collective awareness to sort of pay attention to what's going on. And those were sexually explicit AI-generated images. They were created without consent, circulated far and wide, and deliberately designed to humiliate and control. And yes, it did happen to one of the most famous celebrities, famous people on the planet, but the tools used to create those images, they're available to pretty much anyone. You don't have to be extraordinary to be targeted anymore. You just have to be, in many ways, a woman with an opinion and a profile picture. And here's where it gets pretty interesting and in many ways quite uncomfortable, especially for those of us who perhaps are in a leadership position, because there's structural consequences that kick in from this sort of behavior. The more visible you are, and I know I mentioned, celebrities aren't the only ones that are being targeted, but certainly the more visible you are, the more high profile and public facing you are, the worse that abuse gets. So that's not theory, it's a statistically proven pattern. UNESCO research has shown that 75% of female journalists have faced online violence, and 1 in 4 have received physical threats or death threats. 45% of women in media say that they have to self-censor on social media to avoid abuse. And that's a 50% increase since 2020. Think about that. The more women in the industry, the more they're going quiet because of the impact of this online abuse. And I talk a lot about this. These aren't just platforms, these are places, and these places have real world impacts on people's sense of self, their well-being, their sense of belonging in a workplace, their mental health, levels of anxiety. And of course, we're trying to push for a lot of women to take on these leadership positions, to be high profile, I guess, in many ways, because there is that contagion effect, but it's having a very, very serious impact on the women who do move first, who do step forward. There was an Inter-Parliamentary Union study that found that 60% of female MPs globally have been targeted by hate speech, by disinformation and image-based abuse. And more than 61% of women running for office believe the primary objective for that harassment is to intimidate them out of the political landscape. That, my friends, it's a strategic system doing what it was intended to do, to silence women, to threaten them in a way that means that they will step back and stop having a voice. And here in Australia, our Office of the eSafety Commissioner actually found in a report a number of years ago now, this report's probably about 2 or 3 years old, I'd say, but they have said that 1 in 4 women in Australia will not take on a leadership role if there is a public-facing requirement to that role because of the concerns of threats, not just to them, but also to the rest of their family, their children, their partners, even their parents. So if you're a leader here, think about what that means in your workplace. Is this an invisible dynamic, an issue that you're not seeing? Is this a blind spot for women in your workplace? What does it mean for your board? What does it mean for your executive team? What does it mean for your media spokespeople? The women who never put their hand up, are you an organization that actually doesn't know why they're not doing that? Another area that I think is really important to cover off on here is the sporting arena. And that's where this dynamic of online abuse really becomes pretty impossible to ignore, because the gap between what we celebrate as a community and a culture and what we tolerate is so stark. It's like almost embarrassing. We cheer these women on in Paris. You know, the Olympics was a unifying event for our country, as it is for so many countries all around the world. We watch the AFLW and the NRL with pride, get behind our teams. And, you know, in some cases, we're putting these amazing women on billboards and we're giving them jerseys with their names on their back, but we're still letting the internet do what it does to visible and successful women. You know, if we think about the Paris Olympics, for example, in 2024, that was actually the largest online abuse prevention effort ever conducted in sport. The IOC ran an AI monitoring system across 20,000 athletes and officials' social media accounts, because it isn't just the athletes either. It's the administrative staff, it's the volunteers, it's the officials, it's the judges. And they analysed 2.4 million posts and they flagged over 152 as potentially abusive. And there were 8,900 unique accounts that were sending that abuse. They flagged 152,000 as potentially abusive. And what was the dominant attack vector, you might ask? What's the way that they were doing this? Well, it was gender-based sexualized violence. And this is where it becomes interesting for female athletes, because a lot of the time, when it comes to abuse in sport, if there's abuse directed towards men, it's often about their performance. You know, they might have missed a tackle or they might have dropped a ball. But with women, it's always about their gender. It's about their bodies. So there's a lot of body shaming. It's also about perhaps their mothering. So if they're an athlete, who's looking after the children at home, for example? So, you know, it's not about their times. It's not about their form or their strategy in becoming the best athlete ever. It's always about their bodies and their femininity, and a lot of the time their right to be there at all. If you follow Australian sport, you'll probably remember in 2019 a really, really infamous incident happening with AFLW player Taylor Harris. She was photographed mid-kick in one of the most powerful images you will ever see, an incredible image that should have been absolutely celebrated. But instead, for Taylor, the comments were just so vile that the image was temporarily taken down. And that was an interesting decision as well by the digital media platforms and the television networks, because actually, should they have been preventing that online abuse in the first place? Should they have had technology embedded in their systems that means that people can't abuse people in this way? But no, she had to have this incredible picture of her doing her job, doing a great job at it as well, taken down. So she had to fight in the end to have it put back up. And so as an athlete at the peak of her sport, having to defend her right to exist in a photo of herself doing her job was a really confusing situation as well. If we look at research around sport as well, a fantastic study by Deakin University in 2024 found that 9 in 10 Australian sportswomen, 9 in 10, have experienced online abuse. And the cruel irony of this is that 97% of those women say that their presence on social media is absolutely necessary because it's a professional requirement. We don't have pay equity in sport in so many different ways. So a presence on social media or as an influencer is a requirement for these women. 69% of them actually said that it is a professional requirement. So, you know, they can't protect themselves by going offline. And the algorithm, of course, requires them to be there and be present. The sponsors require them to be there as well. The exposure for the sport requires them to be online. And so do the people who just pretty much want to tear them apart. So, you know, it feels like this isn't a personal resilience problem. It's a trap that athletes are facing every day. So very interesting food for thought. Now, I want to address something clearly here, if you've not sort of picked up on it already, that I feel like we've been dancing around for years when it comes to women in online spaces. And it is that silencing effect. You know, that technical term for this is that silence. And it shows up in very predictable ways. Women delete posts or they stop posting altogether. They avoid certain topics or certain platforms. I don't know too many women who enjoy their time on X anymore. And certain conversations, of course, are a little bit off limits for a lot of women. They, in extreme cases, might reconsider careers and in many cases do step back or are reluctant to step into into leadership. So up to 60% of women and girls globally, statistically, have been forced offline or significantly reduced their online participation because of abuse. And that means that there are fewer women in the conversation shaping culture, shaping societal views, shaping the future in this AI era. And when we have fewer women in rooms, whether virtual or physical, where those decisions get made, we have fewer women that are building networks, their own reputation, their influence, and it's important that they're in the spaces where this increasingly needs to happen. It's also not just a gender equity problem too, like it's obviously absolutely that, but it's a structural problem for every institution that claims to want to have diversity, that understands the data around the impact that can have, that wants to create high levels of psychological safety in their organizations. When women and marginalized staff, communities, intersectional folks are pushed offline, and when they're made unsafe, they lose access to networking. They lose access to reputation building, to speaking opportunities and client engagements that now largely occur in digital spaces. And so those power balances or imbalances, they don't disappear. They just get recreated in a new form. Now, if we layer AI on top of this, because technology, of course, as we know, is not a neutral factor here, we know that AI is amplifying online harms. So it's making them more scalable, increasing anonymity, they're more convincing and sophisticated, and they're significantly harder to detect and address. If we think about deepfakes and voice cloning, for example, they're used in a coordinated approach when it comes to harassment campaigns. Bots are used as well for, pylons, and the capacity to harm people at scale has just genuinely increased. And it's within the reach of anyone with bad intent and a pretty modest internet connection. We're heading into the most technologically complex era, in human history. And we can't afford to have half the population systematically exhausted from a digital public life. And yet that is exactly what is happening here. So what can workplaces do about this? And this is something I want to be really direct about, because I think the framing of this conversation often goes wrong, because people say this is a personal resilience problem, or they might say it's up to the victim to sort themselves out, to build their digital resilience. But it's actually not about individual women needing to manage their time better, or to be a little bit more resilient, or to post smarter, or to grow thicker skin. It's actually an organizational and cultural problem that we're addressing here. And it also has legal dimensions that most workplaces are not deliberate enough in addressing, or are not taking seriously enough. If we look at sport is work. Of course, journalism is work. Our roles as leaders are work. And like every other physical world environment, online abuse is considered a workplace hazard. And under Australian work health and safety laws, employers have a legal duty of care to manage these psychosocial risks, including abuse that occurs through digital channels connected to the workplace. Safe Work Australia is really explicit in this, and that workplaces must provide a safe online working environment, not just a digital one. And there is a positive duty of care here that is absolutely clear. Take reasonable steps to prevent harm before it occurs, not simply respond once it has, not letting it quietly settle in, and not asking the person who has or was harmed, I should say, to handle it themselves. Protecting people can't mean asking individuals to absorb the risk while institutions and businesses stay passive about a problem that is so obvious and systematic. So this episode really has been about the price of being visible, but I don't want to just leave you with the cost. I want to talk about what we can actually do about this in this situation. So in First Movers, I write about 3 steps essentially that I think really matter here. And the first is awareness. And we're doing a great job even listening to this podcast, right? Thank you for listening, and thank you for listening this far. Awareness is about naming a systemic problem and naming it as exactly that, not a personal problem. Start by noticing if this is happening to you, if it's happening to other women that you know, if it's happening in your workplace, where perhaps you might think belonging kind of comes with conditions, if you will, and where silence, I guess, has been the price of entry. What we can't name, we cannot change. So that's the first step. The second step is refusal, right? It's time to refuse the story that online abuse is just the price we have to pay to be visible or to be ambitious. We need to refuse the idea that resilience means enduring that harm without complaining, just having to accept that this is what is going on. And we've got to refuse to normalize environments that ask women to disappear in order to stay safe or to be palatable to people that run those environments. And the third step is really about courageous action. And this is where, of course, it gets much harder, but far more important, because if you're in any position to shape culture or policy, we need to be asking the right questions about, talking about things like reporting pathways, how much education is necessary in this space. We need to be including the digital world in our psychosocial risk assessments, our taxonomies, our scenario planning. And we need to ask whether our organization actually helps people or leaves them to carry the cost of this structural failure alone. So if you lead people, if you manage teams, or if you make decisions in any way, the question is no longer whether it's happening in your organization, because we know that it almost certainly is. The question is, what are you prepared to do about it? Are you prepared to do something to make that change? So you could ask yourself, do we treat the online world as a real psychological safety risk factor? Are we proactive about addressing that, or are we just a little bit reactive? Do we have policies and clear reporting pathways that actually create support for our people? Do we act well when abuse comes from the public into our own walls, virtual or physical? And do we actually help in the end, or do we close the door, forward a policy document and the EAP and hope that that sorts it out for us? And these are only questions we can ask ourselves honestly. In the end, you don't need a fancy title to push for better systems in your workplace or in your industry or in your community. But especially if you work in media or politics or technology or sport or education, many of you would already have a platform. So use the platform. You could share this podcast as a resource for people to think about. And if you're a woman who is listening to this, who in many ways recognizes her story or herself in any of the things that I've described, know that your discomfort here is not a personal failing. The calculation, the moves that you make, the way you think every time you post or you speak or you lead, in many ways, it's not weakness. It is just a rational response in many ways to a system that has made being visible a real risk for you. The good girl bargain, it's still being enforced. And that bargain across generations and history has never been fair, but you were never meant to carry it alone. In the end, even if we think of Eve in the Garden of Eden, when she bit into the apple, her choice wasn't to create chaos. When she left the Garden of Eden, it wasn't to try and create a problem, but she'd woken up in many ways to the reality of what was going on. And I hope that this episode perhaps helps you to do the same. That's it for today's episode of First Movers. If this hit home for you, if you heard something that you think you really needed to hear or that someone else needs to hear, share this episode, subscribe to the podcast. That's genuinely, of course, how this show grows, how these conversations reach the people who really need to hear them the most. First Movers, my book, Courageous Leadership for a Human Future in the AI Era, will be here in a couple of months' time. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, give me a follow, contact me, drop me a DM if you'd like on LinkedIn or on Instagram, and I'll drop those details into the show notes. But until next time, be first, be brave, be a first mover. That's it for today's episode of the First Movers podcast. If this hit home for you or you think someone else needs to hear it, share it and subscribe. That's genuinely how this show grows and how these conversations reach the people who need them most. Keep an eye on yasminlondon.com or follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram, and I'll drop the links in the show notes. Until next time, be first, be brave, and be a first mover.